a mainline Protestant because most mainline churches have a very boomer tech setup, and so are my videos.
Well, this is the first time I've ever live streamed on my channel with a guest. So
Really?
welcome, welcome. Yeah,
Thank
this
you.
is it.
Wow.
This is it. I actually just today bought the like upgraded package for my software so we could make this happen.
Wow,
But
great. That's quite an honor to be the first guest on Rising Star of Catholicism on YouTube.
oh, you're too kind. You're too kind. But we are officially live now. So if you are just now joining us, welcome everybody. We are joined today by somebody who you probably recognize. This is Redeemed Zoomer RZ. How you doing, man? Great to have you on.
Great. I would ask how you're doing, but I think it's a pretty big day for all Catholics around the world. You just got
Yeah,
first new pope since 2013.
I know. I'm excited. I am very excited. I don't know why, but it caught me off guard. The fact that there was a new pope caught me off guard. Obviously, that's what's going on right now. But when it actually happened, I was like, "Oh my gosh." I guess it's probably like a woman who knows their boyfriend is going to propose, but then when it happens, you're like, "Ah."
Right. It's a bit surreal for me because as long as I'm only 22, so as long as I've been aware of the existence of Catholicism and the existence of the papacy, for me the word pope has been synonymous with Pope Francis. So for me it feels weird talking about the pope and it's not Francis.
Isn't that crazy? Like,
Mhm.
I literally the other day, so at the beginning of my rosaries, the first Our Father that we say, I offer that up for the Pope. And for the past like 3 days, I've had to say, for the holy intentions of Pope France, and then be like, oh, wait. For the so yeah, it is nuts. But I want to hit on that a little bit because you have been RZ, you have been a quite outspoken proponent, fan, maybe even of Pope Francis over the past, oh, I don't know how long you've been doing the social media thing, but for the past couple of years. And that's something that many Protestants don't agree with you on, I think, just from my own perspective. Could you just
Right.
say a few things that you liked about Pope Francis and how maybe he kind of was maybe a welcoming face or an open face, open door for Catholicism to you in a certain sense?
Sure. The main reason I like Pope Francis is he was very ecumenical without being heretical or socially liberal. And that is the main goal of mainline Protestantism. I always try to tell people I'm not an evangelical Protestant. I'm a mainline Protestant. Mainline Protestants are the Episcopal Church, the United Methodist Church, the PCUSA, and the
That's the
upside
one
of
you're a
main
part of, right? The
what?
PCUSA. You're a
Yes.
P. Yeah.
Yeah,
Okay.
same with like the Church of England, Church of Scotland. Those are all mainline Protestant churches. The upside of mainline Protestantism is there's so much more unity and Catholicity and ecumenism in mainline Protestantism. All the mainline Protestant churches are united with each other. That's over 300 million Protestants across the world in communion with each other, and that's more than all of Eastern Orthodoxy. Everyone forgets that. So that's the upside of mainline Protestantism. The downside is the ecumenism often breeds liberalism and heresy, and there is much of that in mainline Protestantism.
Hmm.
Not globally, by the way. The majority of mainline Protestants globally are conservative, and that's what I told Trent Horn yesterday. Like we were talking about liberal Presbyterianism in America, and there is a lot of that. There's 2 million Presbyterians in America, and there's 20 million in Africa, and they're way more conservative in Africa. But the point is, it's hard to find that balance between being ecumenical and still being faithful to historic Christian theology and social teaching. And Francis did that better than anyone I've seen in the modern era. Francis was more ecumenical to Protestants than any other pope before him.
Yeah.
He said that Martin Luther was not mistaken in his intentions. And he was in the school of thought that believed Catholics and Protestants have the same view of justification. I'm not sure if I agree with him on that, but I'm not sure if you know about the joint declaration on justification between Catholics and Lutherans in the 1990s. Francis referenced that to say that we have the same view on justification as the Protestants. So I think that's
Yeah.
a very good step for ecumenism. Mainline Protestants also recognize that the Reformation was never meant to be permanent, and the goal is to eventually come back into communion with Rome. It doesn't mean I leave the PCUSA and join the Roman Catholic Church. It means the PCUSA joins the Roman Catholic Church and I along with it. That's what it
Right.
means. Now, obviously, easier said than done. There's a lot that would have to change for that to be possible on both sides.
Yeah.
Um, Ideally on just one of the sides, but probably realistically on both sides. But Pope Francis, I think, was a closer step to achieving that than any other pope we've had, probably since I don't know Gregory the Great in the 600s.
Yeah. Yeah.
So yeah, that's
Yeah.
why I was
And,
a big fan of Pope Francis. People said he was liberal. He was not liberal. He was an ecumenist. That's different, and perhaps a bit too ecumenist for my taste when it came to non-Christian religions. But he said, like, he was clearly not socially liberal. He said there was too
yeah.
much forgacine in the seminaries, and then he apologized, and then said it again. What a Chad!
Well said. Yeah, yeah. No, I think that Pope Francis, so this is the way that it works just in personality types and for leaders in general, is you can usually tell what somebody's greatest strengths are by looking at their greatest weaknesses, right?
Yeah,
And with Pope Francis, I think that most people point out his greatest weakness was this lack of clarity, this ambiguity in some of his sentences and these interviews he did. And they'd hammer on that. But yes, that's a weakness that comes with trying to be as open and as charitable and as accommodating to people with different belief systems than you, right? So
right.
I think that the two go hand in hand, and the fact that he receives such strong criticism, some of it may be fair, right? Some of the things he said I read and I was like, that may be able to be interpreted correctly, but at the same time, that doesn't sound it doesn't sound good at first. But I think that it's revealing some of his greatest strengths in his pontificate as well. Yeah. So could you just say a little bit here? You said something really interesting. You said that the goal is union with Rome again. Could you just
Yes.
say a little bit about concretely what that might even look like? Because in my mind, and this is probably a misrepresentation, you've corrected me charitably on several of my tweets
And
because
sometimes I've
there
corrected you less charitably than I should have.
God bless you, brother. No hard feelings. No hard feelings. But sometimes, because evangelicals are the loudest minority, I think by far, probably, people think Protestant and they think evangelical. And some of my tweets have been aimed at evangelicals. And then you've come in and said, actually, like, we agree. Those are the evangelicals thinking that. But for somebody like you who's in the PCUSA, right?
Yes.
um, what would that look like to come back in communion with Rome? Because that is what I want more than anything. I want a united church. That's what I want. I want you and me to be in full communion. I want you, me, and the Eastern Orthodox, the Russian. I want us all to be under the same roof. I think that's the goal. I think that's what Christ himself wanted in John 17. So what would that even look like?
Obviously, you're right. Obviously, the goal is for the church to be one institutionally, not just the evangelical invisible church, where we're all part of this invisible church that nobody knows where it is. That is not that is not the only goal. It's a tautology to say that the invisible church should be united because it always is. Um, but we want the church to be visibly united too, to reflect that invisible unity. So mainline Protestants are the ones that are actually descended from Luther and Calvin and the Reformers. Evangelical Protestants are all schismatics. They split from the mainline Protestant institutions. They always have a separatist schismatic mindset. They don't want union with other Christians. They don't want union with Rome. Maybe like, oh, we'll unite with Rome if they agree with everything we believe. Um, but that's not what they want. They don't really care about global unity or Catholicity. They just kind of want to be left alone. Evangelicals all have this schismatic mindset. That's not the mindset of the mainline Protestants, and that was not the mindset of the Reformers. None of the Reformers wanted to leave the Roman Catholic Church. They had no choice because they had either explicit or implicit excommunications. Like Luther was explicitly excommunicated. All the other reformers were excommunicated by the councils of Constance and Trent for holding to, Hussite and then later just Protestant beliefs. So reunion was not really a possibility, but that was what they all wanted. So sometimes I will say, these conservative offshoot Presbyterian denominations, these small groups like the PCA that worship in strip malls, they should not have split from the mainline church. The response I always get is, "What about Luther? He split from the church. Why shouldn't we all?" And my response is, no, he did not want to leave the Catholic Church. He got excommunicated. And then the most recent pope says Martin Luther's intentions were not mistaken. I think that's a very good step to achieving this unity. So then Catholics could potentially say, if you're asking me what I think it would look like, Catholics could say, okay, maybe Martin Luther wasn't right about everything. Maybe he was wrong to question the Book of James. Maybe his anti-Semitic statements got a bit out of hand, but his intentions in reforming the church were correct, and we shouldn't have excommunicated him so quickly. And then some of the Protestants might be able to say, okay, maybe we reacted too hard against some of the practices in the church. Maybe we should focus more on the saints. Maybe the reason we all stopped doing that is because of the excesses in the Catholic Church. So maybe if you guys tone down the excesses, we can reintroduce some sort of modest saint veneration in our churches. That's just a theory of mine, because there really was a lot of reactionary extremism against Catholicism in the Protestant churches, which we've changed our mind on. The
Mm,
Presbyterian church, the mainline church, has a magisterium. We can change things. We can see where we went wrong and change it. Most Presbyterians in the 1600s were against celebrating Christmas, for example. It was an overreaction against the excesses of Catholic holidays, where people saw various feast days as more important than the Sabbath on Sunday.
mm,
But most modern Presbyterians are okay with celebrating Christmas, are okay with singing hymns, are okay with musical instruments in church. So we're able to correct some of the excesses of the Reformation. And I think the Catholic Church has fixed a lot of the problems that they had during the time of the Reformation,
mhm.
especially since Vatican II. So I think that's a good step for unity. It's still like 3 out of 100 steps that need to be taken on both sides, but I think there is hope.
Right, right. Wow. Okay. Yeah, a lot there. I want to ask you though. So for me, right, as a Catholic, I see the Pope elected today, Leo the 14th. Everybody pray for Leo the 14th. He's got massive shoes to
Yeah.
fill, and he has a massive task ahead of him. The book of James, chapter 3, verse 1, if I remember correctly, says, "Let not many of you become teachers," right? He is now the teacher of over 1 billion people on this
Wait,
planet.
wait.
So he
Book of James? Pope Luther said that's not in the Bible. What are you talking about?
Well, shoot, if Luther said it, then it's got to be dogma, man.
Well,
Like
you see,
he's
I'm Protestant, and that means the canon of Scripture is whatever I want it to be, and I just took James out of my Bible because I didn't like it.
well, shoot, you got hey, well, I won't quote it anymore then. I'm sorry, but pray for the Pope. But my
Yeah.
question to you is you mentioned how you are in communion with all these other mainline Protestant churches. So for me as a Catholic, I see Leo the 14th elected today, and I see in him the visible source of unity for the church, right? So it's like if an alien came to Earth and said, "Who's in charge here?" I'd be able to go, "This guy." And he has the final say. Maybe he makes the right call, maybe he makes the wrong call, but he's the captain of the ship. He's in charge. So for me as a Catholic, it's very easy for me to see why I'm in communion with people in Africa, Asia, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. How, in what way do you have visible unity with all those other mainline Protestant churches that you said you're in communion with? Because it seems like you're different churches because you have not just different practices, which is okay, right? Like I'm Western Catholic and they're Eastern Catholics. We practice things differently. That's fine. But you're have fundamentally different beliefs on some core issues, or would you not say that's the case?
So, no two people have exactly the same beliefs. All of us have to recognize that there's a difference between essential and non essential beliefs. And I believe that all the mainline Protestants share the same essential beliefs. The things we disagree on, we all agree that those are not essential beliefs. For example, infant baptism or predestination, those are not essential beliefs for us. And I know that predestination is not an essential belief for Catholics either, because the Catholic Church allows a variety of interpretations on what predestination means. That's
Well,
why
the
we'll have some
difference would be with
Augustine.
predestination. Predestination you have to believe in, but what exactly, how that exactly works in people's life is where there's different schools of thought,
Yeah,
right? Like if
and the
somebody
same.
said predestination doesn't exist, be like, okay, well the Bible says it does.
Yeah,
The
yeah,
popes say it do, the councils
and
exactly.
no Protestant church says predestination doesn't exist, but there are Calvinist and Arminian Protestant denominations who are in communion with each other. Now, what does it mean to be in communion? We call it altar and pulpit fellowship. That means we can take communion at each other's churches and we can share pastors with each other. For example, the pastor at my old church back in New York, he was originally ordained in the RCA, the Reformed Church in America. It's the Dutch Reformed denomination.
RCIA?
Nope, sorry. RCA,
I'm just
which is
kidding.
the
I'm just
Dutch
kidding, bro.
Reformed mainline denomination. But he was able to just transition into the PCUSA, no problem, because we're all in community with each other. Mainline Protestantism is like Eastern Orthodoxy minus the exclusivity, where there's multiple jurisdictions that are all in communion with each other. And I would agree with Eastern Orthodox apologists when they say that's more how the early church looked, where there was less universal jurisdiction of the Bishop of Rome. I personally believe that arose as sort of a side effect, a leftover aspect of the Western Roman Empire. When the Western Roman Empire fell, it's funny, the first pope to really exercise universal jurisdiction was Leo the First. Now we just got Leo the 14th. He was the first pope after the fall of the Western Roman Empire. He sort of filled the void that everyone wanted of a really powerful, centralized leader in Rome. So that's my interpretation of how that happened. how the Bishop of Rome became so powerful. But it really does seem like the Eastern Orthodox are right when they say that the model of unity in the early church was more regionalized, and it wasn't like there was one elder who was above absolutely everyone else.
Okay, interesting. So you think that Leo, which ties into what we were originally going to talk about. RZ and I were originally going to talk about how Mary is the mother of God and
Yes.
how Nestorianism is bad. But then the Pope got elected, and I was like, all right, we gotta shift to something else here. It's
Yeah.
like this is what everybody is thinking about, so we got to talk about it. And thank you, RZ, for being flexible on that. Really appreciate
Sure.
that.
I still want
Um,
to talk about Nestorianism because that is a thing that we have to band together against.
I
But yeah.
couldn't agree more. We can get to that. We've got a little bit of time here,
And the new
certainly.
pope is named after Leo the First, and Leo the First he wrote the tome that condemned both Nestorianism and monophysitism. So
True, true. Council of Ephesus, yeah,
no,
very
Council
true.
of Chalcedon.
Yeah, correct. Good job. Well done. I wanted to, though, real quick, talking about. So essentially, you would say that the Roman papacy, the way that we conceive it today, started with Leo in the 5th century ish.
No, I think it has developed in many stages over time, but I think a big milestone was Leo the First because he was like the hero of the Council of Chalcedon, and he really was. He was very important, and he was also very important in protecting Rome from the barbarians. So
Right.
Leo the First is called Leo the Great for a reason. He really was great. But I think after him is when people start to see a large dependence on the Bishop of Rome specifically. So I don't think Leo the First was like a modern pope because the Pope wasn't defined to be infallible until Vatican I. I'm well aware lots of people believed in papal infallibility before Vatican I.
Hmm.
But for example, the Council of Constance says that councils are above the Pope in Haec Sancta, but then Vatican I in Pastor
Hmm.
Aeternus says the Pope is above councils. So I think we don't really see the modern papacy until Vatican I, but I think Chalcedon with Leo the First was a big milestone in elevating the Bishop of Rome above other bishops. Also, another reason for that is that the Patriarch of Alexandria was also called the Pope. That's why Athanasius was called
Hmm.
Pope Athanasius. But the Council of Chalcedon excommunicated the Alexandrians. So after the Council of Chalcedon, there was only one Pope in the church when previously there'd been two.
Yeah, yeah, and they still call their leader the Pope today,
Yes.
if I'm not mistaken. Yeah. So you're talking about this centralization of the papacy happening in stages, right? More or less, and a big watershed moment perhaps would be Leo. Is that
Yes.
the way you would phrase it more?
Yes.
Okay, I'm sure you're aware, but just with all the evidence, the famous quote from or passage, I should say, from Clement the First, who's the Pope in the 1st century, writing to a church in Corinth and saying that you need to be, I'll paraphrase here, but saying you need to be obedient to us or else you will be involved in a grave sin. And then you have, Irenaeus in the 2nd century saying that because of the Church of Rome's superior origin, it's a matter of necessity that all other churches agree with her. Then
Mm-hmm.
you go into Cyprian of Carthage, right, in the 3rd century, maybe around 250, talking about how Christ established one chair, the chair of Peter, and that anyone who's not in, once again, these are paraphrases. I can pull up the exact quotes if you'd like. But essentially saying that communion with the chair of Peter, if somebody doesn't have that, how can they be sure that they're in the one true church? You go on to St. Optatus in the 4th century. St. Optatus makes very clear that the chair of Peter is one of the essential characteristics of the Catholic Church. And
Mm-hmm.
we can talk about what the word Catholic Church means, right? Because
Yeah.
I'm sure in a certain sense you and many other Protestants who know what's going on would say that we are part of the Catholic Church. So we could talk about that. But you see Augustine talking about how the succession of bishops from Peter down to the Pope of his present day is one of the main reasons he remains in the church. So it's like I see how practically there is certainly a development where the papacy starts to grow in power and it starts to exert its influence over other areas of the country or the world more
Mm-hmm.
prominently. I see that certainly. But I also see in the writings of the fathers from the 1st, 2nd, 3rd, 4th century, I see them saying things that strongly indicate to me that the Pope has the final say. The Pope has some sort of supreme authority. And perhaps you wouldn't object to that, but you would say that he used that supreme authority in such a bad way that people were morally obligated to rebel like Luther did. So I'm just curious what your take on that would be.
Yeah, three things. Number one, I would object to supremacy. I wouldn't object to the primacy of the See of Rome. That was universal in the early church, and the Eastern Oriental Orthodox don't deny that. What they object to is supremacy. The Bishop of Rome was often used for appeals, but so were other bishops like Alexandria, for example. Now, regarding the Irenaeus quote, Rome had a reputation for being very orthodox compared to other cities. Like, that's why the letter of Romans is much less critical than the letter to the Galatians or the Corinthians, for example. So in the PCUSA, there's a lot of controversy about like gay marriage, for example. And repeatedly, some of the most orthodox presbyteries are the ones in Pennsylvania. So I have said to people in the PCUSA, all the presbyteries must agree with Pittsburgh because of Pittsburgh's noble origin. It has a very, very prominent history, American church history, and Pittsburgh has a reputation for being very orthodox. First Presbyterian Church Pittsburgh is this beautiful cathedral-looking thing. It's not literally a cathedral because we don't have bishops, but it looks beautiful and it's very historic, and they stand firmly against the new measures to try and make room for same-sex marriage in the PCUSA. So I could say all presbyteries must agree with Pittsburgh. That doesn't mean I believe that the pastor of First Presbyterian Church in Pittsburgh is pastor aeternus, is the pastor of the universe with not just eternal but also temporal supremacy over princes and rulers.
Okay, I see. Yeah, I think that's a very similar argument to what the Eastern Orthodox would say, is that Rome has a primacy and they have a very good track record. Like, they just tend to get things right, so you should agree with them. But
Or
they
at least
don't
they
take
did
it.
in the early church. That's what we would say.
Of course, yeah. For the first, let's say, 5, 6 centuries or what have you, they have a very good track record, and so you ought to agree with them. But they think that it's more of a matter of chance. Maybe not chance is the right word, but it's a matter of circumstance that they happen to be right over the course of the first 6 centuries. Whereas
Mhm.
Roman Catholics look at that data and go, wow, for 600, 700 years straight, the Roman Catholic Church remained Orthodox, and every other major see fell into error, right? Nestorius, all these other heresiarchs, all that going on, but only Rome remains pure for the more or less for the first 6 or 700 years. And so we interpret that data as there being some sort of a positive promise, some sort of something that's preventing the church from falling into error, right? So, yeah, I don't know if you have anything to add on that.
Right. I mean, that's one way to interpret the data, but the Eastern Orthodox would say, oh, Rome was one patriarchate and there were four others. And during the Great Schism, four were on our side and only one was on their side. I've heard Eastern Orthodox make the argument that every time there's been a major split, either with the Nestorians, the Monophysites, or the Latins, it's been four patriarchs on the Orthodox side and just one patriarch on whatever side split off from them. So that is one way to look at the data. There's many other ways to look at the data. So I don't think trying to draw a line based looking at the historical data is the best way to determine what our ecclesiology should be. I think
Mm-hmm.
our ecclesiology should come fundamentally from the scriptures, and Presbyterians believe in covenant theology, where the Old and New Testaments are really part of the same overarching covenant. That's why if you read the Scottish Westminster Divines, when they're basically describing Presbyterian polity, they use the Old and New Testament interchangeably to argue for it. And they also do appeal to the Apostolic Fathers for ecclesiology as well, with the equality of elders and bishops and all that. But we could talk about something else if you want.
Yeah, no. Yeah, well said. Yeah. So I'm curious too with what you just said. You admitted earlier that you don't have a bishop. I think that's what you said. You said we don't have a bishop.
Yes.
Um, does that bother you at all? Because I see in the early church, Saint Cyprian says the bishop is in the church and the church is in the bishop. Saint Jerome talks about, no, excuse me, Saint Ignatius talks about how where the bishop is, there is Jesus Christ, there is the church,
Mhm.
right?
And he's
So
absolutely right about that.
it
I know
see
I'm sounding confusing.
Oh,
The
no, no.
one,
I would love to hear some clarity on that though, because like to me, it's like the church is preserved through the lineage of bishops, and
Mhm.
bishops come from bishops. So as soon as you break that line, this is obviously just apostolic succession, super simplified version of it because we only got an hour here, but more or less, you have to have that succession from the bishops in order to have a valid church. Sounded like, maybe I'm wrong, but it sounded like you said you don't have a bishop. So for me, that would be like, okay, well, that church is invalid, but I would love to hear what you have to say.
Yeah, so when I said we don't have a bishop, we don't have bishops in the modern sense of bishops. So we believe that the definition of bishop has drastically changed over time. In the New Testament, bishops and elders are the same office. Peter Lombard, treading on the vestiges of primitive simplicity, says that Christ left us two offices, which is deacon and elder slash bishop. They're the same office. Even Thomas Aquinas says that bishops and elders are metaphysically the same. So what we think is that we think bishops and elders are the same, and over time, some elders got elevated above the others and became bishops. This is not just our speculation. This is exactly what St. Jerome says happened. If you read the New Testament, elders and bishops are used interchangeably. If you read all the apostolic fathers except Ignatius, if you read Clement and Polycarp and the Didache, bishops and elders are used interchangeably. Ignatius of Antioch is the first to make a distinction, but it seems that for him, a bishop is still kind of like a local senior pastor, because he says to submit to the bishop and your presbytery. It really seems like the bishop is like the head pastor of a local church, and the presbytery are like the elders of the church, kind of like happens in most Presbyterian churches today. It used to be that the bishop would do all baptisms. It doesn't really make sense if the bishop is this virtual bishop that administers a whole region. How is he going to baptize every single baby in that region? That's why the bishop stopped doing baptisms, because eventually they were elevated to this regional authority. But in the early church, in the very early church, elders and bishops were the same. And then to solve certain heresies for a practical reason, some elders were elevated above the others, and they were just referred to as bishops. So we think that it was a practical decision made by the church to elevate some elders above others. But if the
Mhm.
church has the authority to do that, the church also has the authority to undo that. And in the Reformation, the Presbyterian Church undid that, and that's why we're called the Presbyterian Church.
Okay, yeah. Yeah, because what you're describing is still the main view of Western Catholics. The Eastern Catholics, they hold the distinction of bishop, priest, and deacon existed right from the beginning, and that the words were used interchangeably. So you
Mm-hmm.
could call a bishop an elder or an elder a bishop, and that was fine. But the offices were distinct right from the beginning. The Western tradition, following Jerome, as you detailed quite well, I think, has this idea that elders and bishops, the way it was described to me whenever I was in my master's degree, is that elders and bishops, priests and bishops have the same hardware, right? They have all of the functions downloaded, but bishops have unlocked certain software. So it's like a bishop can do an ordination because they've had that software unlocked, but a priest actually has that hardware downloaded, where that's more of the Western view. The Eastern view is a
Yeah.
little bit different, right? But even then, I think you could say that even if the office of bishop and priest became distinct, which is what St. Jerome thinks due to conflicts and needing a visible source of unity, a bishop. Even if that's the case, I think that you could still argue that none of the church fathers would say that a priest or somebody who's not a bishop, even if elder and bishop, the hardware software distinction I just made, even if that's the case, I don't see any of the church fathers saying that a priest is able to ordain or to lay hands on. St. Hippolytus in the second century, I have the quote somewhere, but he says he's talking about the church tradition and he's talking
Mhm.
about the rite of ordination, and he says that the priests lay hands on priests during their ordination. But then he concludes by saying that the bishop alone is to impose hands upon him. He is not ordained to the priesthood, but to serve the bishop. Oh, sorry, that's about deacon. Let me see. I have it here. At the ordaining of a presbyter, the priests, right? At the ordaining of a presbyter, the
Mhm.
priests seal what the bishop ordains. So right there, 215, right? You have this idea that the bishop is the one that ordains and the priests are involved in that, but they're just sealing or
Yeah.
participating in what the bishop is doing. So yeah, I just wonder, like, because Luther was a priest, he's a priest, but I wouldn't see any of the church fathers saying that Luther, as a priest, would be able to ordain priests or deacons or bishops.
uh, that's just not correct in church history. There were some rare examples, even in like the 5th century, of priests ordaining other priests. It wasn't normative practice, but nobody believed that they couldn't do that. Everybody back then believed that presbyterial succession was valid, even if they didn't think it was proper. So, like John Cassian, in a biography of an abbot named Daniel, actually writes of a presbyter ordaining another presbyter. I don't know have the citation right now, but I believe there was an example once of a presbyter ordaining a pope. So just because it wasn't normative practice
I would love to
mean
see that if you can
doesn't mean
find
they
that, by
couldn't
the
do
way.
it. I had some friends working on a project for that, and um, some Catholic apologists, like since 33 AD, who I think has a really good understanding of Protestantism, he admits that there are cases of presbyterial succession in the first millennium church. So presbyterial succession is definitely valid. We could debate whether it's proper, but it's clear from the early church that Presbyterians and Methodists and Lutherans and most actually all mainline Protestants, have valid apostolic succession by the standards of the first millennium church. You have to say that the bishop is ontologically, metaphysically distinct from an elder to claim that we don't have that. But yes, I do believe apostolic succession is necessary. So that's why I believe most non-denominational churches don't really have that. They're not really real churches. And even if they do have that succession, it's almost impossible to verify that they do.
So with Calvin, I'm curious because Calvin was a layperson, right?
Mm-hmm.
So how would Calvinists not have this apostolic succession in your opinion, or is it am I missing something?
Well, the first thing is that we don't trace our succession to Calvin. We trace our succession to Knox.
Right, right. No, and that's fair, but I'm just asking if I were a Calvinist, would you say I have apostolic succession or not?
When you say a Calvinist, are you talking about someone who's part of Calvin's church in Geneva?
Sure, why not?
Right. So I'm not sure exactly how it worked with Calvin. We believe that in extraordinary circumstances, some people can be sort of supernaturally ordained without some succession, but the goal is that they should get succession as soon as possible. Tertullian says this, by the way, even though Tertullian's a bit controversial, we know he's not a liar. We know that he was speaking the truth when he was talking about what churches at his time did. And he said that normatively, churches had succession from the apostles. But then he also says there's some churches that do not have origin from the apostles or their successors, but they are not counted as less apostolic because they have the same apostolic teaching. So if you read Samuel Rutherford, who's the greatest Presbyterian scholastic of the 17th century, if you read Samuel Rutherford, he would say that this apostolic succession is normatively necessary and it's good order to do it, but it's not so absolutely necessary that it's impossible for a church to be an apostolic church without it. But if it's possible for you to have that, then you absolutely should. So even though Calvin wasn't immediately ordained with that succession, obviously Zwingli was. Zwingli
Hmm.
was a Catholic priest. And Zwingli, it's funny, we think of Zwingli as this radical reformer. He kept the Roman Catholic Mass more intact than Luther did. He just took out the parts about like Mary and stuff. But Zwingli was a Catholic priest, and obviously Calvin took over after Zwingli. So to answer your question, yes, all Calvinists and mainline Protestants today do have this ministerial apostolic succession.
Okay. Interesting. Very interesting. Yeah, I guess so. I'll just say what I'm interpreting with this data that you're saying. I see a tremendous amount of complexity, and I see a tremendous amount of complexity about things that really could be salvific issues, determining if somebody has apostolic succession, determining which doctrines are correct, which church you should be a part of. I mean, I think by your own admission, you would say this area of study gets very, very confusing very quickly. Would you agree with that, or do you think there's some sort of a
Absolutely.
meta narrative that I'm missing? You think it's okay?
Yeah.
So for me, it's like if it is the case that matters of salvation, and this is more of a anecdotal or an argument from fittingness. This isn't a hard syllogism by any stretch of the imagination, so don't expect that. But it seems to be the case that if there are things that we must believe to be saved, if there is a church that we must be in union with in order to be saved, and it's true that Christ wants his church to be truly Catholic, meaning universal, meaning it's for everybody, Africans, Asians, doesn't matter where you're from, you need to be a part of Christ's church. That's what he wants for you. Then it seems like there needs to be a way to simplify all this data enough to say to just a grandma, right, or a child, or somebody who's um, not well educated, doesn't have 6 hours a day to spend studying this stuff, because that's what it takes, honestly, to be able to say this is the true church and we can tell because of this, right?
Mm-hmm.
So as a Catholic, I see that in the papacy and in the succession of bishops, and I also see that in the fact that the number one biggest denomination or type of Christianity in the entire world is Catholicism. So if you want to find a church that is the closest to fitting the bill of being truly Catholic and universal, it seems like the Catholic Church would be that. And it seems like the Catholic Church has the ability to, and I'm not negating that the complexities need to be wrestled with, but it has a way to simplify the gospel enough to where it's receivable for just about anybody.
I'm not sure I'd agree with that. Number one, according to mainline Protestantism, the Apostolic Church is bigger than it is according to Catholicism because we believe in a branch theory, and we believe the Apostolic Church includes the Catholic Church, the Eastern Orthodox Church, the Oriental Orthodox Church, and all the mainline Protestant churches. The second thing is I think Protestants do a much better job simplifying the gospel than Catholics do because Catholics often have a hard time boiling down the gospel into like a pretty simple presentation. Oftentimes, if you ask a Catholic what's the gospel, they'll say Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Um, I
Which
think
is correct.
Protestants,
Which is correct.
I mean, yeah, of course. But I think Protestants are the ones that really focus on the perspicuity of the message of Scripture. I think Protestants are really the ones who simplified the message of Christianity, and sometimes they simplified it too much. I think evangelicalism is a case of oversimplifying it. Um, Evangelicals used to tell me that, oh, Catholics often add to the gospel. And I would say, I agree, but I think you guys subtract from the gospel. You guys subtract the sacraments and Christology and Trinitarian theology from the gospel until it becomes just a transactional syllogism about penal substitutionary atonement and maybe not being gay. But I think that we have to have that balance between like some of the over complexity that we see in Catholicism and the oversimplification we see in evangelicalism. But I don't really think it's the case that it makes it easier to know where the church is. Like if you presuppose the Catholic Church is the true church, then sure. But if you presuppose that mainline Protestantism is true, then mainline Protestantism is the true church. But here's the problem. The main distinction between Protestants and ecclesialists is the church restricted to one institution? If you say that it is, it becomes very stressful trying to figure out which one that is. If you say that it isn't, then there are some common themes you can look for to try and see, yeah, as long as this church seems like most historic churches, it's probably okay. But if you presuppose that there is only one institution that is the true church, and maybe some people could be saved outside of it by invincible ignorance. But if you're studying this issue, you become not invincibly ignorant. So that makes it really hard to discern which one that is.
Hmm.
Because Catholicism and Eastern Orthodoxy and Oriental Orthodoxy all have very compelling arguments to have that unique continuity. For example, I
Right.
don't presuppose that any of those churches have unique continuity with the church fathers. I think the church with the best claim to have that is Oriental Orthodoxy. I I like Catholicism the most out of the three of them, but I think the Oriental Orthodox have the best arguments and the least inconsistencies out of all of them. So I
Hmm.
don't really think that Catholicism makes the epistemic problems any easier.
Interesting. Okay. So if we have time, I know you have a big exam coming up tomorrow, which by the way, you were the one that told me this, but the Pope is a math major, and so
Yes.
you and he are cut
Yeah,
from the same
I was
tree, right?
expecting like a pope from Guinea or the Philippines. I was not expecting a pope who went to the same college as one of my cousins who has the same degree in college as me. Yes, I
So
am a math
funny.
major.
Yes, wonderful. But there's two things I wanted to hit on quickly, and I know we're not doing a deep dive into any of these, unfortunately, but there's two things I would like to pick your brain on while I got you here. One is you espouse the idea of the branch theory, and maybe you
Yes.
could lay out for us what that is exactly. But from my perspective and my understanding, well, let's just have you lay it out first, because I don't want to misrepresent your opinion at all.
Okay, so we mainline Protestants believe in the visible church. We do not believe the church is purely invisible. There's an invisible aspect of the church, but like Augustine talks about that, and Vatican II talks about that, people being invisibly united to the church. We believe that there is a visible and invisible aspect of the church. And we believe the visible church is basically the body that is descended from Christ, and it has real authority in the elders slash bishops that can come together in synods and general assemblies and presbyteries. So we believe that. We believe that because this church is fallible, it is possible for this church to split and reunify, just like the Catholic Church has. You have the Western Schism, where there were two popes for a time. So if it's possible for the church to split and reunify at all, it's possible for the church to split indefinitely. Now, does that mean that the church is truly divided? No, but it is divided on an administrative level. So the branch theory is that on an administrative level, the church has diverged over the years without losing the sacramental unity that it's always had since the beginning. There is still one baptism, and the Catholic Church recognizes this. The Catholic Church recognizes there is still one baptism shared by the Roman Catholics and the Eastern Orthodox and the Presbyterians and the Baptists and the Methodists and the Lutherans.
Hmm.
So they still recognize there is a unity, even if these branches of the visible church have branched in different directions. So if you read the statements of the PCUSA, you won't hear this from the PCA because they're schismatics and they hate Catholics. But the PCUSA, we recognize, I almost said Pope Francis because that's what I'm used to. We recognize Pope Leo as a true leader of the Catholic Church. I just don't think Pope Leo has any more ontological authority than my dad, who is an elder at the local PCUSA church. We believe he's been given that authority on a human level, but metaphysically, ontologically, we think all elders have the same degree of authority. That's one of the core tenets of Presbyterianism.
Hmm.
Now, not everyone who believes in branch theory is a Presbyterian like me. A lot of Anglicans believe in branch theory.
Right.
Most mainline Protestants do. But that's basically the gist of it. And I think if you really press Catholics on it, they have to affirm a branch theory, because in the Catholic Church, there's been times when the Catholic Church has split and reunified. So we have a development of doctrine. We take that idea and just take it to the max.
Hmm. So with the branch theory, you were saying that God permits the church to be disunified administerially, but are you making the claim? I just want to clarify. Are you making the claim that all of the branches of the Catholic Church, using the broader sense of the word, like you are, all of the Catholic churches are united in doctrine? Because that doesn't seem to be the case, at least from an outsider's perspective.
Well, is the Catholic Church united on doctrine? We would have to say yes on the essentials and no on the non-essentials.
When you say Catholic, there, you saying
Sorry,
uppercase C,
the Roman
lowercase
Catholic
c?
Church.
Rome,
Is the
okay.
Roman Catholic Church
That's
united
it.
in doctrine?
Right.
If we said yes, we would say there's a lot of important issues that they don't necessarily agree on. But we would say yes, but there is a core of things they do agree on. And
Mhm.
the branch theory just expands that. So a lot of things Protestants believe are really things Catholics believe, but to the nth degree. So we would say that we would have a minimalistic view of what the bare essentials of Christianity are. And the reason we have that is because when people say, what must I do to be saved? It's not like a long essay. It's pretty simple. So we would say the core beliefs are the regula fide. That's what the church fathers talk about. The
Right.
regula fide, which subsists in the Apostles' and Nicene Creeds. Is it a strict, like, legal code of bullet by bullet by bullet? No. But the church fathers didn't see it that way, and they were okay with the fact that they knew they didn't see it that way. So I would say there is doctrinal unity on all the matters essential for salvation.
Mm. Okay. Yeah, I guess that would be kind of the crux of the issue, is like, is believing in the Immaculate Conception necessary for salvation, or is believing in the infallibility of the Deuterocanon necessary for salvation? Whereas
No.
Protestants would say you can affirm that or deny that and still be saved. Whereas
Yes.
Catholics, and I suppose Eastern Orthodox, at least with the infallibility of the Deuterocanon, they would agree that that's a necessary component for the faith, right?
Yeah. Well, here's the thing, like, the Catholics admit that there's a lot of church fathers who didn't believe in the infallibility of the canon or the Immaculate Conception. Like, John
Hmm.
Chrysostom had a lower Mariology than I do, than a lot of the reformers did. So one of my issues with Catholicism is that heresy is about submission to the Pope and the church rather than just objective truth. And they have this idea that something's not really a heresy until the church says it is. So then it's not about what you actually believe. Then it becomes more about whether you submit to the magisterium. Because
Hmm.
Catholics admit that there's a lot of things the early church fathers believed that are now condemned as heresy, but they say it's okay because it wasn't defined as heresy when the church fathers said it.
Right. So a couple things on that. One is that yes, it's true that John Chrysostom in his homilies on Matthew, he basically says that Mary was guilty of at least one sin of vainglory. So he's holding to the opposite of what we as Catholics hold today, which is the sinlessness of Mary. But then you have church fathers like John Damascene, you have church fathers like Ephraim the Syrian, and they held a very, very high Mariology that I think would match more or less, maybe with a little bit more specificity today, but matches more or less what the Catholic Church teaches about
Oh,
Mary today.
I agree. I grant that. But the fact that there are saints in the early church who believed things that the Catholic Church now defines as heresy is a bit problematic for me, because it shows
Right.
that heresy is not about what you objectively believe and more about whether or not you agree with what the church has defined. Because we think
Right.
that truth doesn't change. We think that if something is a heresy now, it was a heresy back then. There's a lot of things that Catholics believe now that might be heresy in 200 years. Maybe
Right.
co-redemptrix or co-mediatrix is going to be defined as infallible dogma. Maybe Maximilian Kolbe's views of Mary are eventually going to become infallible Marian dogma. So
Right.
it's just one of my criticisms of Catholicism, where heresy is less about the objective, timeless truth and more about submission to the magisterium.
Right. So yeah, just a couple things to finish. I want to finish this up, and then let's go from here. And then I want one more question that I'm really curious. It's kind of doctrinal, kind of not. I think it'll be
Okay.
interesting. And then let's go on to talk about Nestorianism and the papacy. And let's end on a high note. Let's end on condemning some heretics together. I like that. But the point that I was just making was the idea that yes, John Chrysostom seems to be in this camp regarding Mary. And then you
Mhm.
have Ambrose and John Damascene over in this camp talking about Mary. So the fact that they are disagreeing on a matter of faith isn't really an issue to me, because the church's function is to play referee, right? So whenever you have in the early church these differing opinions about Mariology or soteriology or what have you, the church is the one, through ordinarily ecumenical councils, that plays referee in that. And so the fact that John Damascene and John Chrysostom don't agree about Mary's sinlessness, that doesn't pose a question to me or a problem to me, because that's the church's role, is to clarify those issues. And then to your point secondarily about submission to a living teaching authority, I see whenever I look at Christ, the living teaching authority, it's like, even if you don't know what he's teaching, you don't really understand it, you are bound to say with Peter in John chapter 6, Lord, to whom else shall we go? You have the words of everlasting life, right? Like, even if I don't really understand the Immaculate Conception or transubstantiation, if Christ taught that to me, I would say, yeah, you know what you're talking about, Jesus, even if I don't know. And then that authority, I see it passed on to the apostles, because it's necessary, from my opinion. And John Henry Newman, maybe I'll put a link in the description of this video or something for anybody watching later. He has a beautiful essay on this where he makes exactly the same point. But after Christ ascends into heaven, he gives to the apostles that kingdom, that teaching authority. So now it's impossible for you to say that you have the Christian faith and not be in union with the apostles, right?
I
The
agree.
things that you believe necessarily imply that you're in union with a living teaching authority. So
Yeah,
then after the death of St. John, and let's say the year 95 AD, something like that, it's like, where does that living teaching authority go? And for
goes to
Catholics, we
the
see it as being a necessary consequence, that there be a living teaching authority that we call the church. And we see these three grades: bishop, priest, deacon. And we talked about the distinction between bishop and priest here a little bit, but we see these hierarchy that the apostles and Christ instituted. And so we say that's where the submission to the living teaching authority goes. So the fact that you're saying it's necessary to submit to a living teaching authority, I actually agree with you. And I don't see that as a problem, though. I see that as the function, the purpose of the church.
Yeah, I want to clarify. I agree that it's necessary to submit to living teaching authority. I believe that the apostles gave the authority to the elders and bishops of the church to teach and bind people's consciences to things. But the church has the authority to clarify what is heresy. They have the authority to clarify what has always been heresy. I don't think they have the authority to say something is now a heresy when it wasn't a heresy before. I'm not bothered by the fact that John Chrysostom didn't believe in the sinlessness of Mary, because I don't think that's an essential for salvation. When Protestants say something is a heresy, so the Bible clearly says, if you confess with your mouth Jesus is Lord and believe in your heart God raised him from the dead, you will be saved. When we call something a heresy, we are saying that if you believe this, that is incompatible with the idea that Jesus is Lord and that God raised him from the dead. So Arianism is a heresy, not because the church said it was. I think Arianism was still a heresy before the Council of Nicaea, because if you don't believe Jesus is eternally God, you can't worship him. Nestorianism is a bit more nuanced, but if you don't believe that Mary gave birth to God, which John MacArthur doesn't believe, then you don't believe Jesus was God, and that's Arianism, which we already know is heresy. I believe Nestorianism was heresy before the Council of Ephesus, and I believe that Arianism was heresy before the Council of Nicaea. So the problem with this Catholic idea that you can make things heresy that weren't heresy before, I think that really cheapens the idea of what heresy actually is.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah. Oh man. Okay. Well, we're gonna we got 20 minutes here, so we're
Okay,
gonna move on to the next
sure.
part if that's okay. There's more that could be said. Well said on your part though. But for anybody just joining us, we have Redeemed Zoomer with us today. We're talking about the papacy. We're talking about all kinds of things. Yeah, RZ, thank you so much again for coming on. This has been great. We're not wrapping up yet because I got one more thing I got to pick your brain on. But you have a final exam tomorrow, so we only got about 20 minutes here. I want
Appreciate
to
it.
know. I'm very, very curious. Capturing Christianity has done a few videos on this, and then some other people responded and didn't like it. And I want to know, because I am in a very real way indebted to Our Lady of Fatima. My grandma had a very strong devotion to Our Lady of Fatima. And after she passed away, I think our entire family kind of just got on board with that. And just for anybody who's maybe not familiar with that, at Fatima in 1917, I'll give the less Catholic version, just the thing that I think everybody can agree on. Some event happened on October 13th of 1917 at this field in the middle of Fatima, Portugal. Something happened that was somewhat miraculous. And a child named Lucia had been going around telling everybody that something was going to happen at Fatima on October 13th at noon. And then something happened. We Catholics call that the miracle of the sun, where the sun apparently was falling from the sky. There's actually photographs of it. You can check it out. It's really interesting. People were crying out to God for mercy. It's raining, and then all of a sudden afterwards, their clothes are dry and everything is in ship-shape condition again. So, as a Catholic, I see that as there's a prophecy where this child, this 11-year-old child, Lucia, is saying something's going to happen October 13th at noon at Fatima. And then I see something actually happening there. And then I see masses of people converting to Christianity or coming back to Christianity after a long time away from the church. So for me, obviously, this isn't biblical, right? This isn't patristic, but I see this as something where it's like, if God were going to give a miracle that would indicate which faith he supported, it seems like Fatima hits all the check marks for me. So I'm just curious, how do you, Capturing Christianity has those videos. I think you responded to those, but how do you interpret that data as a Protestant?
Yeah, there's a few things. Number one, I have a posture of agnosticism towards most modern day miracles. I think that's the healthy posture
I think that's
because
fair.
we all agree there is no new public revelation. So there's a lot of things that different miracles could mean. And there's also a lot of different religious groups that all have miracles. If you talk to Eastern Orthodox apologists, they'll give you many, many examples of fulfilled prophecies from Eastern Orthodox saints that would confirm that Eastern Orthodoxy is the true faith. Many of those prophecies are not the friendliest to Catholicism. I don't necessarily dogmatically affirm Fatima or any of those. Also, some of the Scottish Presbyterians, in their struggle against Catholicism, had fulfilled prophecies because Scottish Presbyterians believed that some of them were real prophets, like John Knox, not uppercase P prophets, but lowercase p prophets, like John Knox and George Wishart, um, prophesying the death of Cardinal Beaton, for example. So we don't think that any of these should be taken for granted as revelation from God. So that's why a posture of agnosticism about all these modern day miracles is the safest option. And who else takes that option is the literal Catholic Church itself. The literal Catholic Church itself does not require you to believe in Fatima. So that's why I myself don't have an opinion one way or another on it. If it is real, I don't want to say it's fake. If it is fake, I don't want to say it's real. And it's possible that there's a mixture of truth and untruth in a lot of the stories we hear about Fatima. Maybe it's something God used to bring people to Christianity, generally speaking. Maybe some of the other details we hear about it are a bit exaggerated, just like a lot of the details about Zaytun are exaggerated. So that's just what I would say. I think we're supposed to go to the scriptures to get our theology, and maybe the way that the church has ministerially interpreted the scriptures secondarily. But I think the only purpose that these miracles have to serve is to confirm what we already know from scripture and the church.
Okay. Okay. So you would say your view is more or less agnostic
Yeah,
as
I'm
to
agnostic about Fatima and Zaytun and all these other things.
agnostic, meaning agnostic as to whether anything actually happened, or agnostic about if it has divine origin?
Agnostic as to why it happened, what it means, and where it comes from.
Okay.
Because
Okay.
I don't know. I wasn't there.
Right. Right. Fair enough. Fair enough. Yeah. Okay, let's move into now the joint effort. Maybe you and I
Yeah.
can team up here. Once again, thank you for coming on, RZ. This has been great. You've been fantastic, very generous with your time. I appreciate that. So thank you once again. But let's go ahead here and talk about Nestorianism, how you see that popping up in different Protestant denominations. And first of all, would you say Nestorianism? Tell us what it is, and then tell us, does it endanger somebody's salvation to believe this?
Okay, so a lot of people think they're exempt from Nestorianism because they misunderstand what it is. The sort of um, Wikipedia understanding of Nestorianism is where you think Jesus is two persons. Nobody ever said that, ever. Nobody said Jesus is two persons. So a lot of evangelicals are like, oh, I'm not Nestorian. I believe Jesus is one person. Okay, great. Nobody believed Jesus is two persons. Nestorianism is really where you separate the humanity and the divinity of Christ such that the personal names for Christ are not absolutely interchangeable. The personal names for Christ are Jesus, Christ, God the Son, the Messiah. Any personal name, any name you are ascribing to the hypostasis, the second person of the Trinity, all those personal names are interchangeable. When we say the word God, we can either be referring to God as just the divine essence, or God as in one of the three persons: God the Father, God the Son, God the Holy Spirit. And it can be confusing, but Trinitarian theology is always confusing, and Trinitarian and Christological heresies are often more straightforward than the actual truth about it. And we all know that. Like, tritheism and modalism is a lot harder to understand than the mystery of the Holy Trinity, but we still believe in the Holy Trinity. So, examples of Nestorianism is where you say that, oh, Mary's the mother of Jesus, but not the mother of God. Or Jesus died on the cross, but God didn't die on the cross. Or the blood of Jesus isn't the blood of God. Now, the famous evangelical mega pastor John MacArthur has very clearly committed two of those three instances of Nestorianism. Now, Nestorius was not as Nestorian as he was accused of being. There was what Nestorius actually believed here, which was just a pretty strong distinction between the two natures. Then there was what Cyril accused him of believing, which is that the Son, God the Son, refers to the divine nature, and Jesus refers to the humanity, and Christ refers to both. And way up in the clouds is what John MacArthur says. He's not only more Nestorian than Nestorius, he's more Nestorian than Nestorius was strawmanned of being. That is how Nestorian a lot of evangelicals are. And
Yeah.
sometimes people will defend them and saying, "Oh, they just don't like the Catholic language." But no, they're Nestorian in other ways. Their sacramentology is also Nestorian because they separate the physical elements of the sacrament from the spiritual workings of God, and they don't think that any physical action can have any spiritual impact on you objectively. That's why they won't say the bread and wine is the body and blood of Christ. That's why they
Mm,
won't say baptism saves, which all traditional Protestants, even the traditional Baptists, were willing to say.
nice, nice. Yeah, yeah. And would you say that Nestorianism is a heresy that endangers the salvation of a Christian?
Yes, I don't think it endangers someone as much as some of the other heresies. Like, I don't think a heresy is guarantees damnation, but I don't think we can speculate that anyone is damned. If someone believes a heresy and refuses to be corrected on it, I would not presume their salvation the way I would for the average Christian. I presume you are saved. I presume the Pope is saved. I presume every baptized Christian who says they believe in it and doesn't give me any reason to suspect otherwise is saved. However, I do not presume that John MacArthur and William Lane Craig are saved for this reason. I don't think it's improbable that they're saved. I just think we can't presume those who very, very clearly violate church teaching on this issue.
But what about all the popes on Twitter that are telling me that
The Pope's on
I'm just
Twitter.
kidding. I just thought some of those evangelical Twitter accounts come across a little pontifical at times.
No, you are joking. Have you seen the cult of personality around John MacArthur?
Oh my gosh. It's yeah.
Have you seen it?
I don't have firsthand experience, just like looking at comments and the way that
So,
people talk
so
about him, but
John MacArthur lives in this very fancy house. Now, here's something I noticed. Catholic monks and nuns live in personal poverty, but their churches are beautiful.
right.
Megachurch pastors live in personal luxury, but their churches are ugly. Have you noticed that?
That
So John MacArthur lives a very lavish lifestyle. He makes a lot of money on selling study Bibles with his name on it. He's had many cases of covering up like marital abuses, just telling wives to submit to their abusive husbands. And there's a there are many YouTube channels entirely dedicated to unconditionally defending John MacArthur. And whenever any criticism of MacArthur is brought up, they don't even address the criticism. They just say MacArthur has done so much for God, so shut up. They
yep.
like I think his name is Justin Peters. He said that John MacArthur has done more for Christianity than anyone since the apostles. They are more papist with John MacArthur than literal papists. I'm not trying to use papist as a slur. I'm just saying that they're acting like John MacArthur's the Pope.
Wow. Wow. Yeah, yeah, it's a good point. Good point. All right, brother. We got 10 minutes left here. Let's go
Okay,
ahead and maybe we can take some questions here.
sure.
Let's see.
Give this guy some super chats, okay? I always beg for super chats on my live stream, so now it's his turn.
You're too kind, brother. You're too kind. But Tyrannosaurus Zeppelin says, RZ, what are your thoughts on Pope Leo the 14th being American? God bless you. I'll pray for your math exam.
I was not expecting it. Like, I have one of my best friends is converting to Catholicism, And she said, "Oh, I'm hoping for someone like Sarah Burke would be great too, but they're not going to elect an American." And I was like, "Yeah, obviously not. That would be like that would start World War III if that happened." And not only is this guy American, but he's made a lot of tweets, and he went to the same university as my cousin and stuff. So that's
Isn't
quite a
that
surprise.
crazy?
Now, I'd be very annoying if I just learned who this guy was, a few hours ago when I already have opinions on him. Um, I don't want to engage in gossip. I do think that some of the friction between Pope Francis and Donald Trump and JD Vance might have prompted them to pick an American pope who also shares the same friction. That's just a theory. I'm not saying I believe that. I'm saying that it's something to think about. However, I am very optimistic about this Pope because like you guys know I like Pope Francis. He seems in every way like a less pro LGBT, more aesthetically traditional version of Pope Francis. And I think that's really the best of both worlds. So even though I think there was some politics involved for sure, when has there ever not been? Not just in Catholicism and Presbyterianism too. Lots of politics in our General Assembly. Even though there definitely was some politics involved, probably. Uh, I think I'm very optimistic about this papacy.
Very good. Very good. Jesus Enjoyer says, RZ, is it true that you smoke cigarettes? I saw a picture of you smoking and then this emoji.
I smoke once in a blue moon with my father-in-law. I don't
There you
smoke
go.
habitually.
Yeah, yeah. I don't know if you're a cigarettes guy, but the
I mostly
cigar
smoke
culture.
cigars.
Okay, good. Yeah. The cigar culture in Catholicism is just it's going wild.
Mhm.
And I feel bad in a certain sense. I don't smoke, I don't drink. I've actually
Maybe
taken a
I
vow.
mean, I don't drink either, but maybe you should smoke.
If I hadn't already taken a vow not to do nicotine or alcohol my entire life, I would probably jump on that train. But in high school and things like this, just seeing friends abuse those substances, I was like, I don't want to be a part of that. So I've
Uh,
never drank, never smoked, and I
yeah,
figured I might as well offer this to the Lord, make it into a sacrifice. So got with my
yeah.
spiritual director and ended up doing that. But I love being around people who are smoking cigars. So
Smells very good. I
it
personally made a
does.
commitment, my wife and I, to never drink ever, but
Nice.
it's not for religious reasons. It's just because I don't like substances that inhibit my senses, or
Hmm.
I hate being nauseous for any reason. My greatest fear is getting the stomach virus. So I'm just not into alcohol for that reason mainly.
That is crazy. Not to be TMI, but I like the stomach virus in a certain sense because, like, all right, I just lost 5 pounds for free.
I said you weren't a heretic, but okay, the
uh,
PCUSA is going to declare today that there's a new heresy that just dropped, and it's what you just said.
oh, well said, brother. Well said. Well said. Oh man, I got a question for you here too. Um, so your dad is a pastor, right? You said that
No,
at the beginning.
he's a lay elder in the Presbyterian
A
Church.
lay elder. Okay,
Yeah.
okay. So did you grow up in being I guess pastor's the wrong kid, lay elder's kid? Is that a
No,
thing or not so much?
he was elected just a few years ago. I didn't grow up religious at all.
Oh, okay.
My mom jokes that she was raised lapsed Catholic, because she was raised by Catholic parents who didn't really care much about it. She was raised very nominal liberal Catholic, left it by the time I was born, recently came back to it. Now my mom's very hardcore Catholic. Um, my dad was raised Jewish, and he left that by the time I was born too. He converted to Christianity at the Presbyterian Church and was baptized, and then I converted to Christianity as a teenager, and I also joined the Presbyterian Church. And just several years ago, my dad was elected as an elder in our church. In the Presbyterian Church, we have lay elders. It's a lot like the early church, like in the Didache, where it says appoint your own bishops from like among your congregation. So the pastor is what's called a teaching elder, and the lay elders are what's called ruling elders. Metaphysically, they're the same office; they just have different positions. Because if someone's going to be teaching and administering the sacraments, they need to have gone to seminary. But if someone's just going to make decisions for the budget of the church, they don't necessarily need to have a seminary
Hmm.
education. They just need to be men of good standing and good reputation.
All right. All right. Good to know. Yeah. Well, glad you converted. I got a couple questions here. We'll go quickly through
And
these as
we can go
quickly.
a few minutes over. I don't have a deadline or anything. I just got to get
Okay,
studying at some point.
good. Yeah. Myron Mercado says, RZ, has your mom converted to Catholicism this last Easter? And then did you attend her confirmation?
No, my mom converted to Catholicism about 8 years ago, about the same time I converted to Christianity. Like she was baptized Catholic and all. She was just returning to the Catholic Church after years of not being in it.
So she didn't receive confirmation when she came back?
I mean, she received confirmation when she was a kid.
Okay. Okay.
She has a very funny confirmation story. I don't think she'll mind me telling it. So, part of the reason she left Catholicism originally is because she was really seeking spiritual answers, but her entire Catholic community growing up was very casual, just didn't care about anything. Her
Yeah.
priests didn't care, nobody cared. So all of her classmates were just trying to get through confirmation so they could graduate and get out of church as fast as possible. She wanted answers, and she had one other kid in her confirmation class, and he looked like he really didn't want to be there. She was so excited to finally do confirmation. So she just said to the priest how excited she was to learn about everything. And he was so impressed by her. He was like, "You don't need to learn anything. You're getting confirmed." And then he looked at the other kid in the class and he was like, "You too," because he was just that
Mm,
lazy. Now, my mom didn't want that at all because she was excited to learn, not to just graduate automatically. But
mhm.
the other kid in her class thought that she faked it to get out of a confirmation. He was like, "Yo, that was genius." And she was like, "What?
Uh,
I didn't do anything. I wanted to." So she was frustrated. She didn't learn what she wanted to. So she left the Catholic Church and joined this Gnostic sect called the Christian Community of Rudolf Steiner, which is what I was
mm.
initially baptized in. It wasn't a valid baptism because it was not a Christian group. But she was involved in that when I was born. And then she realized that was basically a cult, so she left it. And then my family was just sort of secular liberal for most of my childhood. Then I became a Christian as a teenager.
Wow. Beautiful, beautiful, brother.
Mhm.
Aaron Burhi, sorry if I'm saying that incorrectly, said, any future debates planned, RZ?
Debates, yeah, two. So in they're both later this month. One of them is on limited atonement. I'm debating another
Mm,
Calvinist who believes in something called hypothetical universalism, which is sort of like Calvinism without the limited atonement. I do believe in limited atonement. And then there's another debate, a three-way debate on different forms of church polity among different Protestants. Presbyterianism versus Episcopalianism, which would be what you guys believe, versus Congregationalism.
okay. Very good. Let's see. Myron says that, RZ, I love your mom already. Cameron, invite RZ's mom on.
My mom is very based, yes.
Oh, cool. Cool. Love it. Let's do one more here before we sign off, brother. How's that sound?
Sounds great. Thank
Let's
you.
see. Uh, Jesus Enjoyer says, RZ, why don't Presbyterians believe the Eucharist to be an offering slash sacrifice in light of 1 Corinthians 10 and many early church fathers affirming a kind of sacrificial aspect to the Eucharist?
There is a sacrificial aspect to the Eucharist. We think it's a sacrifice of praise and thanksgiving because the name Eucharist means thanksgiving. We don't think it's a propitiatory sacrifice. We're not offering anything to God. God offers himself to us in the Eucharist. That's why we have a communion table rather than an altar, because we're not making a sacrifice to God. God is sacrificing himself for us in communion. If you read a Reformed Catholic, the title of the work is A Reformed Catholic by William Perkins, one of the best Puritan divines. He explains our disagreement and agreement with Catholicism on many issues, including whether the Eucharist is a sacrifice. And he says, in a sense, it is, just not a propitiatory sacrifice.
Mm, interesting. Interesting. All right. Well, Redeem Zoomer, thank you so much for coming on. If I'm taking anything away from this, my main thing is that you and I think, both need to be as prayerful and as active as we can, trying to find a way to reunite the clans, right? Trying to bring everybody
Yes.
back under the same roof. That's what ecumenism is for. It's not for the
Mhm.
sake of me being right in an argument. That's what apologetics is for. It's not for the sake of me beating you over the head with something I read from St. Augustine, right? And I appreciate your approach on that. I think that's really what you have in heart and in mind. So thank you once again for coming on. Really appreciate it. Tell people where to find you. I'm sure they probably know, but give
Yeah, just
yourself a
Redeem
little plug
Zoomer
here.
on Instagram and YouTube.
Yeah, beautiful, brother. Beautiful. All right, everybody out here in the super chat, or in the chat. If it's a super chat, I won't stop you, but everybody out here in the chat.
Freudian slipped right there.
Oh man. RZ is predestined to be best prot Catholic apologist. So that's, I think you're probably right. He's one of the good ones.
I do admit my videos have converted a lot of people to Catholicism because a lot of people are coming from a non-denominational background, and I'm the first person they hear explaining Catholicism honestly. My intent is not to convert them, it's just to explain Catholicism honestly. But when honestly, Catholicism is far superior to what most of them were raised with in the
Yep.
evangelical church. So yeah, that makes them convert.
Same thing with Peterson. I think Peterson brought a lot of people to Christianity in general, just because if you're having Christianity explained to you by a Christian, you assume they want to get you, you know?
Yeah.
All right, brother. Everybody who is in the chat, please say a prayer for our new Pope. He definitely needs it. Watching his facial expressions whenever he was elected, there was certainly moments of joy, and then I felt certainly moments of, oh my gosh, like I'm the Pope. That's big shoes. So be sure to pray for our Pope. And RZ, thank you, brother. God
God
bless you.
bless.